So we're now right on time, and we've got our first panel this morning is from Michelle Cyca and Trina Roache on journalism perspectives on identity fraud, and it'll be moderated by Dr. Christy Bressette. So Trina Roache is going to be joining us via Zoom today. And our moderator, Dr. Christy Bressette, is from Western University's first Vice Provost and Associate Vice President of Indigenous Initiatives. Her Anishinaabe name is NICF, which translates the hardworking woman. Throughout her career, Christy has demonstrated an astute ability for bridging cultural differences between people to help ensure inclusive, equitable, and quality educational opportunities for all. I'd like to now invite Dr. Bressette to the stage to introduce the panel.
No, I'm fine. Bonjour, everyone. Neta no kikwe indigenous cause, kikunan dunjuba, mijikan dodem, Anishinaabe kwe endao. So my name is Christy Bressette. My spirit name is Hardworking Woman, given to me a long time ago by my great-grandfather, Dave Bressette. I'm so very happy to be here with you today. I am very honored with the request to moderate a very important panel as we get started in our discussions today. And the discussion panel will be focusing on journalism perspectives on identity fraud. So as was mentioned before by many, this is going to be it is a challenging topic. It's something we all need support in understanding and knowing how best to come at it. So the conference organizers have made arrangements to bring forward to you some amazing people, some strong Indigenous women who are going to be sharing with you their perspectives from an Indigenous journalist perspective on these matters. So it's my pleasure to introduce, first of all, Michelle Cyca. I haven't seen her yet this morning. Oh, there she is right there. Michelle Cyca is a member of the Muskeg Lake First Nation in Treaty 6, and previously an employee of the Emily Carr University, where she works as a freelance journalist and an editor in Vancouver. Michelle is currently the editor of an Indigenous-led conversation for the Norwal and a contributing writer to the Walrus. So I want to welcome you, Michelle. Thank you for helping us today. And we also have another colleague. I believe she's going to be online in any moment now. So Trina Roache will be joining us online.
Hi. I am here.
Oh, there she is. Okay, wonderful.
Hi.
Trina Roache is a proud member of the Goose Clap Mi'kmaq community and an award-winning video journalist and the Rogers Chair in Journalism at the University of King's College. Trina brings over 2 decades of experience working for the CBC, the APN National News, and APTN Investigates. She brings all of this to her current role as an educator. So please join me in welcoming Trina.
Well, thank you.
And I'll just let you know that my role is at the Western University in London, Ontario. I've been supporting there as the inaugural Vice Provost and Associate Vice President for Indigenous Initiatives since 2021. So I'm really happy to be here. I'm just reflecting on last year when we had the event. I wasn't able to join, and none of us were actually, it was online, but I remember I had COVID at that time, but I was watching as I laid there. So before we get started, I too want to acknowledge these lands, these beautiful lands that we're meeting upon today, and also acknowledge the elders who are with us, who show us the way forward, and the knowledge keepers, and also acknowledge members of the First Nations University of Canada and the National Indigenous University Senior Leaders Association. Also, thank you to you all for your work. So before we came together, colleagues, Michelle and Trina, we got together and we talked about how can we best support members who are here with us today, Indigenous people who are endeavoring to address this issue. We talked a lot about this, and we wanted to make the very most of our time together. And it was very apparent to us as we spoke that reporting on Indigenous fraud, what the role of journalists looks like. And basically, there are choices for journalists. In this regards, we're talking about non-Indigenous journalists. They can either help to inform the issue through trauma-informed reporting and educating on the issue, or if there is a lack of preparation, this can cause further harm, such as the impact of reckless and irresponsible reporting, where the readers and people who are involved are negatively impacted. So I want to get started this morning with the first question that I have for our amazing panelists by asking about your experiences. And so perhaps we could start with Michelle first. And I wondered if you could share with the audience some of your highlights about your experiences in journalism that help us to understand the magnitude of this problem.
Sure. Can everybody hear me? I just want to say it's such an honor to be here, especially as someone who's no longer quite in the academic world. I feel like a very fortunate guest. So thank you so much for having me. I come to the work of writing about Indigenous identity fraud from being in an institution, Emily Carr University, where a case was unfolding while I was an employee there. And it was very valuable for not only shaping how I report on these stories, but my understanding of how these issues impact Indigenous people in the academy. And as a staff member, as an administrator at the university, understanding the ways that the structure of these institutions is not necessarily hospitable to Indigenous practices of identity affirmation or open dialogue, and the ways that Indigenous people within those systems can be very vulnerable in terms of speaking about their experiences, asking questions, questioning power. The institution is not designed for those methods, and as Lynn put it really well in the previous panel on witnessing, it's the institution is designed to serve itself and not necessarily the Indigenous communities. And so when I left Emily Carr University to work full-time as a journalist, I had that experience and the connections to begin reporting on the story. And one thing that really helped me understand the magnitude of the problem was how many people I reached out to who had very similar stories at their own institutions. Of coming in contact with people whose identity claims are questionable and not even being able to ask them openly, where do you come from and who are your people? Because those questions are not really permitted within the context of an institution. And to me, that's one of the challenges and the responsibilities of journalism on this topic, is untangling the ways that the systems that Indigenous people live and work in are not created for them. And so we're often navigating these two worlds of our responsibilities to our communities and to ourselves and our identities and our nations and the institutions where we work. And I think that makes the issue incredibly complicated. And I think the role of journalism here is to help the public and especially non-Indigenous people who are the source of many of these identity fraud issues, to understand the factors that make these cases so prevalent and so damaging. And well, maybe I want to pause and make sure that Trina can speak as well on this one.
Yeah, thank you for that, Michelle. Okay, so over to you, Trina. We just want to invite you if you would share some of the highlights about your experiences in journalism and how that helps us understand the magnitude of the problem.
Yeah, thank you so much, Willalio. And I wish I could be there in person. I wish that had been possible, but I'm working and teaching right now. I would have loved to have heard some of the panels that happened earlier. First of all, I always start with this conversation and saying that, well, pretendians or Indigenous identity fraud is, like most things, it's a Canadian issue that impacts Indigenous people. So we always have to sort of frame the story in that sense. My own personal experience as a reporter, because I started working for APTN way back in 2001, and I had to do that work. Like, I'm from the Glooscap First Nation, but I traveled sometimes outside of Mi'kma'ki, but even within Mi'kma'ki, I mean, there's communities in Listugush and Newfoundland and all through New Brunswick. And so I had to do that work. I would show up with my camera. I was a video journalist, and I would get those quotes. Where are you? You know, we would do that with each other. Oh, who are you? Where are you from? What community? You know, who's your family? And that's just the process of how we place ourselves and how we see how we're connected to each other. So I have that sort of experience of doing that as a journalist. I haven't reported. I was at APTN when APTN reported, Jorge Barrera had reported on Joseph Boyden. And that was kind of one of the first real stories that had happened. And I just remember, like, the complexity of that and the conversations that I wasn't part of the reporting on that, but just the conversations that we had, how difficult it is to do the research and the investigation, and then handle all the fallout that happens from those kind of stories. And the fallout is something because, and we can talk about the challenges in reporting as we go further, so I won't talk too much about that now. But certainly my own reporting, I did quite a few stories on just the complexities that are involved in when we start talking about identity because of colonial harms, through, you know, gender discrimination in the Indian Act and all the 60 Scoop, all of those things that have disconnected people from community and people finding a way back. And I think that this issue around Indigenous identity fraud is just another one of those colonial harms that impacts identity. And so it's really important that journalists cover the story and do a good job of covering the story. And we can talk about some of the challenges. But now I've moved over. I'm not with APTN anymore. A couple of years ago, I moved over to teaching. And so now I'm teaching journalism, and teaching best practices around reporting, especially reporting on Indigenous stories. I always avoid saying Indigenous issues because that denotes that Indigenous people always have problems. So we cover Indigenous stories and communities and people. But now, like, Kings in particular is trying to recruit a Mi'kmaq cohort. So we're trying to encourage Mi'kmaq students to consider journalism. And so now I can see both sides of this issue as a journalist covering it, and now in the world of academia, trying to discern that if we're offering seats for Mi'kmaq students, that we have to determine that those seats go to Mi'kmaq students. So I can see both sides, and I look forward to the discussion today.
Okay, miigwech for that, Trina. So, yeah, thank you. Thank you both for getting us started. Obviously, this is a very, very difficult issue, and we've talked a lot about how we would bring this information to you. And so we've obviously gotten started with some consideration about the impact that this has on people who are been impacted by these events. We also wanted to focus a little bit more on in journalism, the opportunities we have to educate the public to help address these issues. So I guess the second focus of questioning we wanted to talk about is from a journalist perspective. What were the concerns observed in relating to reporting on Indigenous fraud that you have? Concerns in relation to how it's done or the impact or what the role of journalism and journalists have in this regard? Perhaps we could start with you, Michelle, with your thoughts on that one.
Yes. I have many thoughts on that. I think the most significant one, the biggest responsibility that I try to bring into any story with Indigenous people is thinking of the intent of that story and how it could either help or harm the people involved. And I'm aware of the fact that people who are coming to the media with stories about suspected or known Indigenous identity fraud are putting themselves at risk to do that, particularly in the academy where, you know, it may implicate their own scholarship or their opportunities to teach or learn. And, you know, it's necessary to have their perspectives. That's what informs the reporting, but it's also incredibly important to handle those with care and to be cognizant of what people are putting on the line in order to bring that truth forward. And so I feel a really great responsibility when I'm speaking to somebody about this issue to let them know how their words might be used, to explain my responsibility and positionality, to give them a sense of how the story is progressing. I think it's really important that people be informed when they're dealing with media about what's going to happen with what they've shared, because there is the potential for harm, particularly if someone brings this forward and nothing comes of it. So I also feel an obligation that when people bring you these stories, you have to witness them, and then you'll have to figure out if you can help to bring them to light. So that's the biggest one, I think. And in terms of the perspective I bring as an Indigenous journalist, I mean, I think probably everyone in this room can speak to the challenges of being an Indigenous person in a majority non-Indigenous space. Indigenous people are underrepresented in academia, and they're also underrepresented in media. And often what that means is you're expected to be a kind of pan-Indigenous translator of cultural protocols, of histories, of nations. And so I try and be really clear about my background, my position as a Cree person, as a member of an urban Indigenous community that's not on my homeland. I think it's important not to try and fulfill that settler expectation of being able to speak to every Indigenous issue. I appreciate what Trina said about not using issues. Speak to every Indigenous story. So I think that's really important too. And I think that's something that Indigenous journalists have an obligation and do a lot of work to push back on in media is that we can only bring our own perspective. And I think that perspective is really valuable for informing how these stories are told, for navigating the nuances of them through the lens of our own history and our own identity. But I think we also have to be clear about who we are and where we come from and why we're telling these stories, what we're trying to do with them. A byproduct of the incredible interest that these stories generate among audiences, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous alike, is there's a huge appetite for them. And I do worry how the interest and enthusiasm in some cases for reading about cases of identity fraud is not being met by the necessary depth and care in telling those stories, or in the accompanying learning of looking beyond thinking of these as, you know, stories of individuals doing bad things and getting away with it, and more about the structural and systemic factors that have facilitated identity fraud, as well as the harms that often fall on that, you know, that 90% below the iceberg, the people who are not as visible, whose stories maybe aren't seen as newsworthy, the communities that are dealing with this kind of fallout. So lately, what I really want to bring to this is not just talking about this as an individual phenomenon, but as a phenomenon of settler colonialism that's linked inextricably to all of these larger systems, and trying to keep the focus there. Because I think, you know, stories that take down individuals one by one for their transgressions are not going to solve the problem of identity fraud.
Yeah, it was very, very insightful. Thank you so much for sharing, Michelle. couple of really key points I've taken away from there is, there is that tendency to expect all Indigenous reporters or Indigenous people to be the expert on all Indigenous people. And having that platform of being involved in media is definitely an opportunity to provide clarity in education. So let's pass it over to Trina. Trina, what are your thoughts in addition to what Michelle has already shared on any concerns that you might have in relation to reporting on Indigenous fraud?
Yeah, I really thought about this in terms of like for Indigenous reporters in particular. And I totally agree. Like I've always said, and my expertise ends like at the edge, at the sort of western edge of Mi'kma'ki. Like if I had to go report in Treaty 6 territory, I would have to do all the homework that every journalist should do in Canada, which is, history of treaties, who are the key players, all of those things. So we don't, I really appreciate that, that we don't hold pan-Indigenous knowledge comment. Because that's a thing that we get asked a lot when we're in institutions and when I get asked to speak sometimes. But the challenge, I saw a couple of specific challenges, like especially for Indigenous reporting. Often it's like my experience at APTN was that I was one reporter for all of the Atlantic region. So covering, communities and maybe sometimes even nationally when I went like to investigates, but covering communities that are really spread out across like 5 provinces. You're just kind of running from story to story all the time. And these kind of stories, when you're looking at identity fraud, take an enormous amount of time and resources. And so it can be a very challenging story. Like there's just, unfortunately, like there's sort of a dearth of like Indigenous journalists. Like we can all name some, there's some high profile Indigenous journalists, but just when you look at a specific location, there's probably a handful. And so it becomes a lot of weight on the shoulders. And these are really like, I always viewed myself as a Mi'kmaq journalist that I'm a public servant. That's what journalists do. That's what we are. We're public service. Like we do stories in the service of the public. And my public has always been the Mi'kmaq or wider Indigenous communities, is because I worked for APTN as a national newscaster. And so anything that impacts Indigenous peoples became a story that I would want to do. So obviously, this is a story that would be very important that I would want to cover, but it was always just there's that challenge of time and resources. And then even if you are in a mainstream newsroom like CBC, and maybe you do have those resources, you can see that you end up being maybe the one Indigenous journalist in the newsroom and somehow expected to have expertise that maybe you don't have because it's not your community. And so I just think like Indigenous journalists in particular have a lot of challenges coming up to these stories. And that's in terms of the journalism aspect. But then there's the other side of it, which is that, journalists are people. And we also can face a lot of lateral violence and pushback when we do these kind of stories, or we're talking to people like Michelle said, and we have to have the best of intentions and that do no harm philosophy. And these stories can be really challenging. And so it is about also managing expectations for people who are going to be in the story about, maybe what they may face or how the story might turn out, or that the story might not be something that you can go with because, these stories require so much research and kind of a paper trail or something. So, lots of challenges, but I think there's lots of room in the reporting for the contextual elements, the nuances, the follow-ups on how this impacts, like Michelle said, like that's a more systemic view. So it's not, just a story about like one individual, who perpetrated identity fraud, but it's about the larger, like, why is this happening? Like, what is the issue with Canadian or American identity? I always say I always hate the trope for Indigenous stories where, Indigenous people are the victims somehow, and then they'll interview like a non-Indigenous expert who has the answer. And I'm like, we have lots of experts. So always, there's lots of people with agency and expertise and all that. So we can do that in our own communities, except in this story. I think maybe this is the story where you could have a non-Indigenous expert talking about, I don't know, non-Indigenous like psychology or sociology or something to explain like why people feel the need to take on Indigenous identity. But yeah, so there's a lot of challenges, just practical challenges in terms of reporting, but also just in terms of ethics and care in reporting.
Yeah, very helpful. Thank you, Trina. So you brought up, both of you, Michelle and Trina, brought up really important aspects to be mindful in this work and the resources it takes and the time, usually on top of all the other work that you're endeavoring to do. It lands on you, whether you like that or not. And what Trina just talked about now is Signal 2 is there is a role for allies within media to help support, to help educate, to help follow Indigenous lead in how to best report on this work. So we can clearly see that there are a lot of issues here. And for many of you, when these matters arise in your institutions, you're the people who are past the microphone put in front of you and want you to speak to the issue. So we thought maybe it would be a great opportunity to also explore some best practices in dealing with the media or dealing with this issue at this time. So what we want to do in terms of our next question is talk about how, in your expert opinions, Trina and Michelle, how can intentionality within reporting and integrity within journalism be leveraged to help address these issues? I know you've referenced and spoken to bits and pieces of this, but just coming right at it, how can we use reporting and the media to help address these issues that we encounter?
I can speak first, I guess. I mean, I think an outcome of so much reporting on this is that there is a growing understanding of these cases of identity fraud as connected to a larger issue of kind of reverse colonialism and erasure of Indigenous people. And that does provide an opportunity, I think, to link the stories themselves to larger impact, those impacts on communities, those impacts on Indigenous scholarship. And so I think, the benefit of being a reporter is your work is out there for people to see and assess. And I think that going to media who have a track record of reporting on Indigenous issues with care, who you may have trust with yourself if you know them, you can bring stories to them as well that deepen this narrative. I think that's valuable. And I really believe that there's different ways that different kinds of media can serve this. So the main story that I published on Indigenous identity fraud, which was for Maclean's magazine, was a very long feature story. It was about 8,000 words. And that gave me the space to talk about issues of identity, of family connection, of community connection, of protocol. And I think there's space in a longer form piece to do that. But as Trina said, it takes an incredible amount of resources to do a story like that. But sometimes I think you do need that length. You need the space to tell these stories right. And so I think for media themselves and for people who are approaching media, maybe with concerns and stories, thinking about the format of how that story will be told or the timeline of telling that story is really valuable, because a lot of these stories can't and shouldn't be rushed. There's so much complexity, and I think the biggest fear that everybody has in investigating this topic, whether within the academy or outside of it, is making a mistake that does more harm. So I would really encourage people to reach out to media with these stories. I have seen firsthand, and I think everyone here, what a powerful lever it is to have the media report on these stories. I think in many cases, it's the only reason why there has been action in many universities, is because of the public pressure of media reporting. But at the same time, I think ensuring that you can bring to journalists the context and the information they need to tell the story well is valuable, and it's a responsibility that obviously flows both ways. The journalist has a responsibility to ensure that they understand the context that they're reporting in, that they've spoken to people who can provide that necessary perspective, and that they're not making any assumptions that could lead to further harm or further misunderstanding.
Very good. Yeah, that's great. There is an awful lot within the platform of being in the media that can help in this issue, and giving time, demanding that there be proper time and resources to tell a story is very important. Thank you, Michelle. So over to you, Trina. What were your thoughts about the same question in terms of the intentionality we can bring to this issue through reporting, and how can we raise integrity within journalism? Maybe it's not even within integrity within journalism, but just reporting in a manner that helps to flesh out this issue and helps educate, and using media as a platform help address the issues.
I think, yeah, media does have can be a really powerful tool. Like Michelle said, I think that it does shine a spotlight on an issue that maybe people know in community and have like told and feel the impact of, but didn't know how to come forward. It is not an easy story to bring forward. Like we said, I mean, these do require a lot of research. But the thing is about media is we're always looking for another story, right? So if you feel like one story didn't quite capture, you can always push for another story. Media are always looking for story. And I think in terms of just speaking as a journalist, like I always say that journalists, because you do so many stories over the years, you kind of know a little bit about a lot of things, but not always a lot about any one thing in particular, except maybe journalism. I feel like I know a lot about journalism. But the experts, we rely, this is why we call people, this is why we pick up the phone, is to talk to experts like in the room and on Zoom here. You guys are the experts. And so when we're calling, to ask questions, sometimes that's where you guys have the opportunity to really give a reporter guidance on what the story is. And I mean, the main principles and tenets of journalism, we have talk about fairness and balance and journalistic independence. The journalists have really good research skills. Like we know how to dig, we know how to find people, we know how to find information. But the key one is accuracy. And so I always encourage people, like a story should be like accurate. The context should be accurate, and not just in terms of like a single fact or how someone spelled their name, but even like the narrative. And sometimes even the narrative of the pretendian is that it is somehow an Indigenous person who isn't what they said they were, but that's not it. It's someone who is not, it's not Indigenous. It's a non-Indigenous, like I said, a non-Indigenous person who has adopted or pretended to be Indigenous. And so even just sort of flipping the narrative that this is not an Indigenous issue, I think is really important, that media start to make sure that that is the narrative, that this is a Canadian or American issue that impacts Indigenous people. But in terms of like conversations that you can have when a reporter calls, and I know we're going to sort of talk about best practices, so I don't want to jump ahead, but our sometimes media, like when we call, I think sometimes people are like, oh no, here's a reporter's calling. But a lot of times we're calling because we want to understand. Like when I have a conversation with people, I'm really wanting to understand. Like I can read a report or I can read through materials, but I need someone to help put things in context, to tell me what's important about the report or about the issue. And so think of yourselves as having that opportunity when media calls to really point people in the right direction, point people to the right person. Like maybe you're not the right person, but you know who they should be talking to. So I think that journalists can serve a really important role and have a really important place to play in this sort of truth telling. And it can be a really uncomfortable truth when someone's not who they say they are. And these stories are often complex. I think when we read the story and we see the investigation, like when we see, you know, when I read Michelle's story, I can see that it all makes sense. But I can imagine that at the beginning of that, when we're starting the investigation, it's not always clear, like, how do we know someone's not exactly who they say they are? And so, so there are a lot of questions and direction that can happen definitely at the beginning of a story. Anyways, yeah, I do have some thoughts on best practices, but I think we're getting there. So I don't want to jump ahead of myself.
Yeah, thank you. We are. That's coming right up. And I'll just mention to folks, people here, if you have questions that you're come up as we're talking about these issues, just hang on to them, because we're creating an opportunity to have your questions addressed. And those of you in person, of course, those people who are joining us online. So we definitely hear about the importance of narrative, taking control of that back, or using this platform to help educate. One thing we're very aware of is the process and the media's role in outing fraudsters. So we have a question about that. We know it's very important. We know the process has to be appropriate, but what we want to also know about is, what does, in your perspective, what does trauma-informed reporting look like? And why is that important in these matters?
I think trauma-informed reporting is a necessary lens to bring to almost any Indigenous story, especially one like this that connects back to legacies of disenfranchisement and colonialism. And also, I think it connects to a really present trauma, which is the way that Indigenous people often enter a space like a university and realize that they're not safe, and that maybe someone they've trusted has betrayed that trust. That's a very present kind of trauma. And so I try and bring to the story, and I think it's important, you know, as we've spoken so much about ensuring that there's context, it's understanding the person and their full story beyond maybe just the piece of the story you're telling. So every good piece of journalism should really have a lot below the surface that you don't even necessarily see in the final product, but it does require building relationships and building trust of seeing that whole person and the story they're bringing to you, even if you only are, you know, publishing a small piece of that in service of the story that you're telling. That understanding is what makes the reporting solid and what makes the story valuable. And so I really try and bring to the work that I do an ability to spend real quality time with people and hear their stories, give them the opportunity to set their own boundaries in terms of what they're comfortable speaking about. I know that most people don't receive any kind of training on how to speak to media, even if they're in a role that requires them to. And so by the same, you know, the same logic, a lot of people don't really know how media works, and that's not a failing, or it's not a responsibility anyone should have. But it gives me a responsibility of telling them about that process, and giving them the opportunity to really understand what they're getting into, and ensuring that they feel safe and comfortable before we do really often any on the record interviewing at all. I think that's really important. And I think, you know, what it often means is I speak to someone who has a really important perspective or a really important story, and I just can't use any of it in my reporting because it would put them at risk. But that's not anyone's obligation, I think, to put themselves on the line that way, especially when you're speaking to younger scholars or students. In that case, it's just a sign that there's more reporting to do. And and I just say that because I think both as an Indigenous journalist, and I imagine many of you have felt the pressure that you are obligated to do this work because it's so important. And that means saying yes to things that maybe you feel make you unsafe or that you're uncomfortable with. And I really encourage people to take the time and support they need to do that. And if that means saying no to an opportunity or not speaking to a story, that's also okay. I really never want anyone to feel pressured into giving a statement or participating in a story if they don't feel like it's a safe choice for them.
Yeah, thank you. That's really important. We heard echoes of that too this morning from the witnesses, how very important it is to safeguard yourself, safeguard the people around you. and take the time to get informed and prepare. It's not something that has to be done right away. So taking control back in the situation is what I'm hearing loud and clear. And Trina, over to you in terms of what your thoughts are in terms of reporting and how we should be outing fraudsters, specifically within a trauma-informed approach.
Yeah, I think like I mean, the sort of basics of trauma-informed reporting, you know, you can offer people you know, a real understanding of the impact of the story and really pulling back the curtain on the process of, I think most people, like Michelle said, don't really know what journalists do, or even a journalist, as a journalist, like even the steps and the processes that go from me having a story idea or someone coming to me with a story and the actual product. You know, there's someone who writes headlines, you have an editor, there's story means, there's a lot of levels and a lot of decision making that go into a story, and there's constraints around the format. Like Michelle said earlier, you know, a longer feature story, maybe you can take the time to explore the nuance and the context. And sometimes, you know, in a half-hour TV newscast, you might have a minute and a half for that story. And so it gets really hard to fit in all the appropriate context. And so sometimes the challenges are around just even the format of news, depending on the platform. But I think, you know, there's just some trauma-informed basics, you know, allowing people to have like a support person with them, that they don't have to be alone when they do an interview, you know, making sure that people know that they have our contact information, that we're checking in with them, that we're following up. We've talked about before, I think we talked in our conversation before this session about, you know, like sometimes people wanting to, because we do have sort of, there are rules when you work in a newsroom, you know, you can't let people read your story before it goes to air and things like that. And sometimes that's what people will ask. They want to know what the story is before it goes to air. But there's ways that we can sort of work around, right? We can fact check, we can, you know, I can tell someone, well, I'm using this clip in this context, and maybe they're not reading my whole script, but they have access to the parts of the interview that I decided to use, you know, from my conversation with them. It's always this tricky balance of being collaborative and sort of maintaining that journalistic independence. And that's always a balance that sometimes we struggle with as journalists, and particularly in reporting in Indigenous communities, because sometimes we have this rule, and, you know, as journalists that, well, I would never let the Prime Minister, you know, have the ability to approve or not approve of my story. And then we just sort of blanket apply that rule around editorial control to every interview. But I always say, like, interviewing like an auntie on the res is not the same. Someone who's never done a media interview, that's not the same. So we have to use some discretion and make people comfortable and allow people to like decide that they don't want to be included in the story, right? If they feel like they changed their mind because they're anticipating some pushback or harm. And some of the interviews that we're going to do around a story like Indigenous identity fraud is not like who is a victim, right? So trauma-informed reporting usually kicks in when we're dealing with someone who's been harmed. And in this instance, sometimes that's a really wide swath of people, but the particular people you're interviewing might be in the position more as experts or accountability if they are, you know, in charge of hiring at an institution or in charge of the policy around self-identification. And so that might be more of an accountability interview, which we approach differently than we do other kinds of interviews. So there's lots of ways we can approach a story and approach different interviews. But good reporting is always explaining to people sort of what your goal is, what the impacts of the stories are, and allowing people an out, unless they are a politician. They, if they agree to the interview, they're just stuck agreeing to the interview. But just having some discretion and realizing that different people, we don't have to apply the rules in sort of a blanket way. That we can use our, like we can just be human about things sometimes is a good is a good approach.
Yeah, miigwech for that. Miigwech, Trina and Michelle, your thoughts are, it's very obvious. You come from you're experts in your areas, and this is really helpful. What I've heard is, helping the public understand really the impact and how far reaching this abuse impacts people, impacts students, impacts communities. And there is the other side of the perspective, the impact that it has on the person who's been outed as well. So it's just negative all the way around, and knowing how to control the media, how to maintain that narrative in a good way that educates is so important. And I guess that brings us to that one question we were talking about, and that would be to knowing that there are people in the room who will be past the microphone to speak to these issues in their institutions or even in community. We wanted to ask what you wanted to share with leaders in terms of when it does come to that time when you're asked to speak to these issues, what are some of the factors or tips or even effective practices that Indigenous leaders can use when engaging with the media on these issues? We've heard several really great promising practices, best practices that have been shared already, but specifically, I know you've been thinking about this. What tips or advice do you have for people in this room who are going to be engaging with the media on these matters? Michelle?
I think a big tip that I have for anybody, and this is coming to you also from someone who did work in university communications, is just to be prepared for speaking to media. I really feel like more university faculty and senior administrators should receive media training. I think it's really valuable. Just because there are instincts that kick in when you're speaking to a reporter. Something we spoke about with Trina in our kind of pre-meeting was the impulse that people often have to answer a question, even if they don't know how to answer it. If somebody asks you, you want to supply an answer. And that can lead to later thinking, oh, maybe I shouldn't have said that, or I wasn't well positioned to say that. So just even having the familiarity of what it's like to be interviewed, I think can be really helpful for ensuring that you come prepared and know how to speak to a reporter. Something I've been reflecting on and how these stories are reported in media is the arc of the kind of pretendian story that often seems to terminate in that person's removal from their position. That happened at Emily Carr. It's happened with Carrie Barassa. In a way, it seems like it's like a finale on that story. And something I find frustrating as a reporter, and what I found frustrating within a university is, that doesn't address in any way the harm that's left behind, like the cratering of trust or respect, or address the circumstances that led to that situation unfolding in the first place. And so again, it's not just focusing on this one individual and whether or not they are not still employed, but what's happening in that space elsewhere. Yes. What work is continuing to happen. And I know that's work that everyone here is engaged in, but it's something that I've seen in media, and something that I'm thinking about is how do we ensure these stories aren't kind of built around that narrative of this one person and their impact, and not forget about all the people who are impacted beyond that window. But that's a bit of a digression. The other thing I would say is just, there's, I think now, a real awareness that these stories will make their way out into the public beyond the walls of the academy. Mm-hmm. And my sense is that many institutions are really not prepared for that eventuality. They haven't thought about how they would address this. They aren't prepared to speak to it. And I think there really needs to be an understanding that when a story like this comes to light, if it impacts an institution that you're in, you need to be prepared to answer questions about it, or to at least be asked those questions. And, you know, that's really important rather than trying to contain. I think it's just a certain amount of preparing for, I don't want to call it preparing for the worst, because I think getting these stories out into the public is actually very important, but preparing for that discomfort, I guess, of navigating this in a public way. At the same time, we've spoken about a few things already, but I'll just reiterate them again. I think, you know, you have the right to move at your own pace. I feel like it's important to be honest and transparent as much as you're able to, but you're not beholden to a reporter's deadline or their expectations of your availability. That's an important one. I think that it's, you know, a great practice to look up a reporter and what else they've done, or the institution or outlet that they're working for, before you agree to an interview. I think just to get a sense of how they might tell the story or what their intentions are. And I think that, you know, interviewing can be a two-way street. I like to give people the chance to ask me questions as well. And I think building that trust and rapport is important, because as Trina said, you know, you can't usually see a story before it's published. That's not an option that people have. But if you have good trust and rapport with that reporter, then hopefully you feel confident going into that interview. And so taking the time to ask questions as well is a valuable thing to do. Or, you know, if a story is getting to the point where it's going to be in the media one way or another, maybe going to an outlet that you have trust with if you're beginning to get those requests.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's very helpful. Thank you so much for those thoughts. Absolutely. Building trust, growing trust. And I think I recall it being said in our pre-conversation that even after a story comes out, if you're seeing that maybe you were misrepresented or misquoted, you could double back and insist that those corrections be made. Yeah, very important. Okay, over to you, Trina. What were your thoughts on the matter? Just building on some of these really great areas that Michelle had already alluded to in terms of tips. How can we prepare? What do we know needs to be done as we address these issues in the institution or from wherever we're encountering them? And certainly being prepared has been a really strong theme, knowing how the university can speak to these issues and preparing for when this does happen by being ready. But what further would you say is good to share with other leaders in the meeting today, or people who are here as we have to face these issues sometimes? Hopefully we don't, but we do. What are your thoughts?
They are coming, and I read a report recently that there's I think that it was like thousands of like these cases, and so these stories are definitely going to sort of keep happening. The first thing, you know, if a reporter calls, some of my tips are just like really just practical things, like negotiate, understand if you're on or off the record, right? A reporter is just going to assume, hopefully they'll sort of introduce themselves, identify themselves as a journalist, and then they might instigate a conversation around, you know, we're on the record or off the record, or can I record this phone call? But they are taking notes, and so I think it's really important that someone who's being interviewed understand, because you might not know you're on the record. So just to have clarification, because sometimes a reporter might just be calling to get background information. They might be like Michelle, who just wants to have a conversation, introduce herself, or they might be on deadline and just trying to get comment really quickly. So just clarify and negotiate what's on the record and what's off the record. Develop a relationship with media, with reporters, so that when, you know, these stories arise, you kind of know, or like someone just said, do research to, you know, if a reporter calls, yeah, you're not on their deadline schedule. You can take your time. These kind of answers require you to be prepared, so you can take that time to be prepared. And like I said, you can have someone with you if that makes you more comfortable. And just background, like look at that reporter's previous work. Just do a quick Google and see if that's who you want to talk to. Maybe you're not comfortable. Maybe you see that they haven't done a good job on other stories. And so, but being proactive too, and sort of having events, inviting media to things, you know, developing that relationship. So you sort of have that working relationship with media in advance, so that when these stories arise, you kind of know maybe who's going to be able to handle the story. And again, yes, making sure that you always get a reporter's contact information so that you can follow up if there's any inaccuracies or misrepresentation, so that you can set that record straight and get them to do a correction is really important.
Let me go for that. Thanks, Trina. So I really like that idea of being proactive, anticipating that this is going to come, being really intentional with the work, and creating boundaries, safeguarding oneself. So this was really, this is the opportunity now in our panel where if you have questions that you have for our expert panelists in relation to the media's role in journalism in outing fraudsters, I'd like to invite those questions. Maybe if you could just raise your hand up, or if there's a mic to come around to you all, and certainly those who are online. We want to invite questions from you as well. And we have a technical team who are on standby, ready to receive your questions and relay them to our panelists. So I think I see a person in the back here. I see we got a microphone and a runner and a person. Yeah, so again, these sessions are really to, you know, realize that media can be a harm, but it can also be a help. And we're coming at it with intentionality and integrity and using this platform to educate. So I thought I seen a question just right back here. Oh, she was beating. Oh, okay. She's really into it.
I do see an answer. I do see a question on the live stream or on the Zoom call.
Okay. Yeah, please go ahead. I can't see that question.
Oh, okay. Well, I'll just read it. It says, within the context of your presentations, what are the distinguishing investigative skills of CBC reporter Jeff Leo that essentially broke the story of Mary Ellen Turple-Lafond? So basically just asking us to sort of assess the investigative skills of and he's an award-winning, like Jeff Leo is, he is an accomplished journalist, that's for sure. Did you, I'll throw that first to Michelle. Did you have thoughts, just because you also did that similar sort of similar investigative work? What was your thoughts when you read the Jeff Leo's story on Mary Ellen Turple-Lafond?
I mean, that's the kind of story that you can really tell had months and months of research and investigation behind it. You know, I think similarly as a lot of these pretendian stories, when they finally make their way to media, are stories that people have been sharing and talking about for many years before they were reported. Every story that you see reported of a person, especially a person as prominent as Mary Ellen Turple-Lafond, has been researched for months. That's an incredible amount of work to get a story to that point. And so a lot of that is Jeff's work as a reporter and as someone who's really really skilled in his field. But it's also, there's, I think, a lot of people behind the scenes, fact checkers, people reviewing the legal elements of those stories, who are doing a lot of the work as well as editors. You know, I think the investigative skills really speak for themselves there. There was such a tremendous amount of reporting in that story. And, you know, just the number of government documents of people from the Norway House First Nation who spoke to that story, like a ton of work that was really wide ranging. Some of the concerns that I had reading that story was I did feel like there was a bit of an emphasis on well, actually, I don't want to get into that too much. I think he's very skilled as a reporter. I think that was the story where I can see the different ways that an Indigenous journalist might have told that story. Just in terms of how some of the discussions of ancestry or blood quantum or status were framed, I think could have used more context, particularly given the length that that story had. Again, I'm really cognizant of the fact that so many people who read these stories are not Indigenous themselves. And so they're learning a lot by what they're reading about how they understand Indigenous identity. And so there's, I think, an incredible responsibility to ensure that things are explained very clearly. Distinctions like non-status versus communities that are not recognized by any First Nations people, for instance, or, you know, there's a lot there. These stories, as we've all said over and over, are incredibly complex, but I think that's a story that is so complicated that it requires some consideration of how people will take away lessons or insights that may not be as comprehensive as they need to understand these complexities.
Yeah, thanks for that. Trina, did you have more to add on that particular?
Yeah, just that I think when these stories come out, there's always this reaction of like, oh, really? Like, and then when I read, because I'd seen the headline a few times, and then when I read it, I mean, yeah, the amount of research, really locking down this paper trail. I mean, you have to have that before you publish a story like that. And so I think connecting all those dots and doing that level of research, I think there's always part of me sometimes when I read these stories, I think, just to echo Michelle, is that, you know, there's a whole lot of knowledge that we have and everyone here in this room would have about identity and how status works and this different sections of status and all of, you know, like non-status and the colonial harms that the Canadian public, they just have no idea about. And so when you're publishing on CBC, your audience is the wider Canadian public. And sometimes I always say, when I did a story for APTN, I didn't have to explain a lot of stuff because I knew the audience knew it. CBC does have a wider, it is the Canadian public. And so, yeah, some of the nuances and context sometimes maybe don't get represented in the same way. So when you're an Indigenous person reading, you kind of can see what's missing, where I think just a regular reader might not realize. And so maybe maybe that's where some of the coverage can focus going forward. Some of it already is, but.
Helpful. Thank you. I think there is another question.
Yeah, we have a comment and a question from Jolie Saskamoose. The comment is, most of the journalists exposing the stories are not Indigenous and do not employ these compassionate approaches. So this is well and good. However, it's not the approach of journalists breaking the stories. And then the question is about, what is the role of the institution in addressing the harms that are left behind? For example, the University of Regina has not acknowledged the harms done by VN Timmins, while FNU has, but the University of Regina remains quiet. They could have expressed disappointment rather than let the wounds fester.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you for that question. It's kind of a comment. There's a bit of a question there, and the question that will put a twist on that so that it does come from the expertise of our panelists is, what is the role of institutions in reporting on this or addressing these issues? You know, we could come at it from a policy perspective. We could talk about media training, media information, but what are your thoughts on that, Michelle?
I just want to speak briefly to the comment about how many of these stories have been broken by non-Indigenous journalists, because I do think that there's an important role that non-Indigenous media play in these stories. You know, as Trina said, a lot of these are not Indigenous stories. They're non-Indigenous people elevated by non-Indigenous institutions who have assumed an identity. Mm-hmm. And what I would like to see is the scope moving beyond the focus on those individuals and their supposed identity to critique the institutions and the colonial systems that have enabled them. I think that's a really important role for non-Indigenous journalists. That's where, you know, the non-Indigenous world has a lot of their own work to do. So, and I also just think from a pure, numbers perspective, there aren't enough Indigenous
Yeah.
journalists who would like to cover these stories, have the capacity to do them, have the resources or support to do them.
Mhm.
So there has to be non-Indigenous allyship. And I appreciate that there are reporters who are trying to learn and move through that. And I think they have a really important role to play. So I just wanted to share that. In terms of the role of institutions, this question really resonated with me because I have been distressed, and I think I was very disappointed after my story about Emily Carr University came out that I didn't see anything from that institution that felt to me like an apology or an acknowledgement of harm. And I'm not sure if that's an institutional resistance to anything that might look like culpability or liability. But I think it's really powerful to acknowledge that you made a mistake. And, I thought that was really powerful when Lynn said that when she was in her previous role, she made a mistake and she was sorry. Like, everybody is going to make mistakes in this work. It's really challenging. It's really complicated. We're moving through it the best we can. And there has to be an acknowledgement that things have been done wrong, that mistakes have been made. And that's a really fundamental part, I think, of addressing that harm and moving forward. And I think it can be really powerful. And so what I would like from institutions is not just, saying what they're going to do differently in the future, but talking about what they've done so far and where they maybe made a mistake or where they have seen harm caused and what they're doing to repair it. Often reconciliation takes this form of just adding new good things on top of the past without stopping to reflect or consider, what should have been done differently. And I think you can't balance the scales by adding more scholarships or more opportunities for Indigenous people if you're not addressing the harm that they've already suffered. And so I would really like to see more institutions, and more leaders of those institutions in whatever capacity they have, just say, I caused harm and I'm sorry, and be willing to listen to the people who were harmed and consider how they can begin to repair that.
Yeah.
It can't just always be about moving forward in this relentless way. It has to have space for reflection and for apology, I think.
Yeah, well stated. Thank you. There is so much we really need to focus on sitting with the truth. There's so much tendency to jump over that right into trying to work towards reconciliation. So we'll hear from you, Trina, on your thoughts, and then we have one more question from the floor here, and then I believe our time is up already.
Yeah, just quickly, just on the 2 points. So Indigenous journalism versus non-Indigenous journalism. I mean, I've said what is Indigenous journalism? Like, how is it different? I mean, you're going out, you're reporting. I was filming with a camera. And we have to remember that journalism itself is kind of a Western institution. So even sometimes when you have an Indigenous reporter in a newsroom, it doesn't really sort of change anything. Just like when you have an Indigenous people in an academic institution, how much is it changing that institution, or do we have to change to fit the institution? So I think journalism kind of has that same struggle. And so in terms of when we talk about indigenizing or decolonizing, all those buzzwords, what do they actually look like? And I think that's kind of that could be a whole other forum and conference, which could be really interesting. But I think that action, just in terms of when an institution doesn't do anything. I mean, academia, I think, does move slow. I'm learning that. It's not always the quickest institution. But I think lack of action is usually a story. We do stories about people who are doing things or institutions that are making changes. When those changes, lack of action is also a story. And so I think if your institution, if there's a lack of action, that's also maybe when you should reach out to media and say nothing's happening, there should be something happening. And so maybe a tip for engaging in media is around that. Yeah, we have time for one more question, so I'll shut up.
Thank you so much for that. Okay, question from the floor.
Hi, my name's Jean Taye. Hi, Michelle. One of her sources. I'm grateful for the journalism that has exposed this issue to the public, because I think it's been hugely important. But I'm troubled by the salacious quality of the exposés. And I'm thinking that I'm thinking back to a story that Robin Doolittle did for the Globe and Mail about exposing how the police fail to act on complaints about sexual assault. And she did this incredible piece, I think probably spent years investigating that, to go through police reports all across the country, collate them all, talk about how many complaints, how they didn't follow through. And so I'm wondering if there's a possibility, this following up on your statement about Emily Carr's lack of response, if there's a possibility of doing a big media story that collates this in terms of institutional response, not just the academy, but government and other institutions on this issue of Indigenous identity fraud, that is not focused on exposing a single individual, so that we can have a better scope and understanding of the institutions and how they have created this problem and how they're dealing with it. And I think we'll find that some are doing well and others are burying their heads in the sand. I would note the federal government as the biggest ostrich with its head in the sand right now, but I'm looking at whether that's possible in light of the fact that media attention span is short.
Mhm.
But it seems to me that that's the necessary next step, because we saw this in sexual assault. You get a particular story about an individual terrible story, and then it all fades away again. And then we get the same one 3 months later and it fades away again. And then we get another one. But it's not until you get a bigger one where she actually got response from the police and they actually changed some of their practices. So I'm wondering if there's a possibility of a larger story here.
Yeah, I'll just quickly speak to that. Thank you for that. I do know that throughout today and tomorrow, we're looking to be cognizant of just this, the follow-up pieces, developing principles, maybe calls to action, but a plan forward to take control of this. And I really like that idea, and probably these points can be summarized in a report. But did you have anything beyond that to share, Michelle and Trina, on this need to educate and talk about the impact from our perspectives?
Jean, I'm so glad you brought that up, because lately I have been reaching out to universities that have made some kind of statement or commitment to ask how they're changing their policies. I'm in the very slow process of getting comment, but that's where I think the really interesting story is what are the larger factors here and how are they changing? Because again, it's very easy. I mean, it's clean in one sense to just remove someone who's been called out from a position. I know it's not easy from an HR perspective, but it's an outcome that you can point to. And the bigger challenge, both for reporting and for institutions, is considering all the factors that brought you to that point, the policies, the practices. And as much as I think we're in an era where people understand that self-identification alone is not sufficient, it is still used by the majority of public institutions in all kinds of ways. There's nothing that has been developed to replace it. And so I think that there is definitely a story there. I mean, that's the kind of reporting I would like to do. It's the kind of thing that's challenging to do in that daily news cycle where it really is, as Trina said, about things happening. But I think it's important to bring those pieces together. And that's where experts, like yourself, who brings this expertise in the law and how that works, it's really necessary for people who understand the systems as well to be consulted as experts to help people understand how these pieces hang together. And the implications of them. There's a lot of ways that self-identification is being used in court cases, in hiring, in opportunities still, like in, far beyond the university, and they are all connected to the same culture of appropriation of Indigenous identity, of settler colonialism, of attempting, I think, to really erase Indigenous sovereignty. And I think that's the big picture that we need to connect for people. To me, that's the really urgent issue, is how do the cumulative effects here lead to a really systematic erasure of Indigenous rights and Indigenous self-determination. And I think that's sometimes a harder story to tell and to get attention on, but I do think it's an important one. And I do think that the appetite in some ways created by these stories, where at a certain point after you read about your 5th or 6th high profile Pretendian, I do think people are starting to ask, why does this keep happening?
Exactly.
And that's where there's value in that bigger explanatory work.
Thank you. Yeah,
Thanks for asking.
very well stated. So I guess the last word is going to be with you, Trina. Anything that you would like to share as we wrap up this particular session?
I'll just add, because I think Michelle spoke to that so well, but there's always opportunities. Like journalism isn't just, that reporter who's working for that night's newscast. There's lots of different platforms now. There's people who produce podcasts, who do that deep journalism or slow, like there's fast and slow. But there's lots of opportunities for collaboration, because maybe a journalist doesn't have, like, if there's a group that's like, sort of, looking at some of this data and knows how to access the data, because it is a data story to some extent, right? If we're talking about numbers, maybe mapping out institutions, and there's all kinds of ways that the story could be told, but maybe there's sort of like a collaborative effort that could be like, so I would encourage, if anyone sort of has this kind of project, that maybe you bring media on board for that longer term story. And there are platforms now. We have a lot of different ways to tell stories that are in depth and well-rounded. And even if they involve non-Indigenous reporters, I think we can always bring in Indigenous voices and work together so that it's a really collaborative effort to tell this really, really important story.
Yeah, well said. Thank you. I want to thank you both so very much, Michelle and Trina, for all the work that you do, for bringing your thoughts and your good hearts with us today as we attempt to navigate this and take control of the matter and educate the public. Chimigwech to both of you for all that you do. And thanks for your help this morning as we discuss this.
Well, Elio, thank you.
Well done.
Thank you very much to Michelle, Trina, and Christy for that engaging conversation. We're coming up to our first break here. I just want to remind folks that we do have the beading kits that are available at the registration table upon when you walk in there. We got some enthused beaders over here that are, yay, beads, yeah. So we'll keep that up too, and we'll get that energy nice and high. We do have name tags as well for those folks that haven't picked up your name tag. We're coming into the first break here, so we're going to want to exercise some Kyoge win. Let's get our relations nice and strong again. So it helps to have the name tag sometimes. So that's always super good. Thank you very much to the panel again. Please join me in thanking that panel. This just in on the heels of this. It is Norman Fleury's 74th birthday today. We're going to take 10 minutes for a wellness break, and then we'll resume with our first keynote presenter of the day.